Hello everyone. This video is a long time coming. I've been wanting to do this video for a long time. It's probably going to be 3 videos to be fair. But it's on the topic of anger and the nuances of that emotion and how we make sense of it and problems that can arise either from, arguably too much anger where people have like anger management problems, they're impulsive or dysregulated with their anger, or otherwise, people who are very passive or quiet, they're excessively people-pleasing, they have difficulties asserting themselves, the possibility of conflict makes them very uncomfortable, and arguably they don't have enough anger or capacity to feel that emotion when it is necessary or warranted. So I think there's going to be something in this video for everyone, or the videos that kind of comprise this topic. A lot of the things I'm going to share with you I did not learn in graduate school, unfortunately. It's something that I had to come to just through my own learning and experience and working with people, other workshops, other therapists that I'd followed and learned from. So we're going to jump into what I kind of see as the 5 parts of an emotion. 5 components or 5 pieces or 5 things that you want to tend to describe or capture something like anger as an emotion. So there's 5 parts of an emotion. So the first part I would say involves the behavior. Now it might be behavior as you can see or witness from an outsider perspective. So it could be, in the case of anger, it would be what? It would be, maybe it involves, a scowl on the face, the eyes kind of squinting. Anger tends to see with a focus, and we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. Maybe it's just a smirk on the face, implying that the person is in possession of this power that they're really, kind of trying to reserve or restrain or prevent themselves from acting upon. Maybe it's other things, but it could also be, I suppose, stomping around, throwing things, physically lashing out. But I would say that that's more aggression than anger per se. So that is maybe like the behavioral component, some of the behavioral components of anger. Then we look at like the thoughts. So you might have angry thoughts. How are you interpreting a situation? Anger tends to have often emotions in general do, but anger especially, there's an aboutness to it. You're angry about something. Or there's a directing itself toward something or someone in one's thoughts. So you might have the thought like, well, that wasn't fair. I don't deserve this crap. I'm not going to put up with this. I hate what this person is doing right now. I'm furious with you. Like, these might be the thoughts. So they're the concepts. They're the linguistic internal framing in the first person, in one's mind, so to speak. So that's the thought-based stuff. Like if you were to write this stuff down on paper, I don't deserve this crap. I'm not going to put up with it. I hate what you're doing to me. I don't deserve it. Whatever. All that stuff on paper, if someone's to pick up the paper, which are thoughts on a page, they might infer that this person is angry. So we have the behavior, we have the thoughts. Another part, which I would say is the core or essential component of an emotion, is the what it's like of the emotion, what we call the phenomenology. In the first person, what are the symptoms of this emotion? What are the sensations? What do you notice experientially in your body? How does it manifest in a way that only you can know as you're experiencing it, right? So in this sense, to know a feeling is to experience it, and so that's an important part. So let's walk through that. And we'll remind everybody like what anger is supposed to feel like in an uncomplicated way. And as we'll see, these feelings can get complicated with other competing energies and feelings that that muddy the waters a little bit. So anger in an uncomplicated way, I would say, involves an expansiveness in the chest. You feel like, rather than a pressure, a constriction tightening you up and clamping you down, you feel this pressure from the inside out. You feel enlarged in your body. Metaphorically speaking, it's kind of like if you imagine what it would feel like to be one of those, microwavable popcorn bags, and as it just expands and it just feels this intense kind of pressure or movement outward. That's what anger is, and then there's a heat to it, and the heat is primarily, in the sternum. It moves up into the chest and down into the shoulders. That's where you feel the heat. You don't feel the heat, as a flushness in your face or heat in your extremities, your hands. That can be a sign of something else, or some of the complicating factors that I alluded to just now. Anger sees with a squint, so you're focused on the target of your anger, whether that person is there, in the environment that you are also in, or whether they're just there in your mind's eyes. You're able to think about them, and you're focused on that person with whom you're angry. Anger has that adrenaline rush and that power in your body where you feel strong, it's dynamic, it is ready to move. So when you're in that visceral energy, like your body just like you want to get up and move around, but it's not like an anxious, flighty, just fidgety, restless energy. It's like just a dynamic, rhythmic, powerful energy that is ready to do something. It wants to do something. That's part of what the anger is. What else to say about that? It's an assertive energy. It's a readiness to be directed outward towards someone or something. And your heart rate might be a little bit elevated, but it's not like a flighty, fluttery, anxious sort of feeling, but rather like the beating of a war drum. It's just powerful and rhythmic. So that is, for the most part, like what I would describe as the phenomenology or the what it's like of anger. And again, I would say that is the cornerstone of when we describe an emotion, the phenomenology, the what it's like of that feeling is what we're trying to capture. That's what we're referencing. Even the words, the language, the word or the statement, I am angry, it is intelligible to another person, mostly because they've experienced something similar themselves, but they understand that the word ought to reference back to the feeling. That sometimes you can have the words, or you can make a statement, an angry statement, but the feeling isn't quite there, right? So we haven't fully captured the emotion if that's the case. So we've talked about the behavioral component of an emotion, the thought-based component of the emotion, the phenomenology of the emotion, which I would say is the most important part. And then we have, like, from a scientific perspective, a scientific point of view, we can look at the neurochemical processes involved in all of that. So what is going on in the neurophysiology of this person in the body, from a medical perspective or a scientific perspective, what's happening in the brain, this kind of thing. And it's been a while, but I think the anger circuits as mapped out by Jaak Panksepp involve something like the para-aqueductal gray, the PAG nucleus, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and maybe some other pieces. But it's not really relevant to us here. But just know that that's part of the causal explanation to understand like what's going on with anger. So if that feeling, the sensations that I described, if that is showing up in that way, then those circuits are also being activated, right? So, and then the last component is, what we might call the socially situated embodied self in a given culture, society, in a way like the cultural currency of a given emotion, the permissiveness or the tendency to repress or deny certain kinds of emotions, that's going to play a part as well. So if you live in a culture or society where anger is seen as healthy and normal, then it's something that will be easier, let's say, to experience and communicate, and in those situations where it's useful. Other cultures, maybe it's taboo, it's ignored, it's glossed over, it's denied outright, which can create problems. In some ways, emotions that are adjacent to something like anger is amplified within the culture, which can create issues. So right now, I would say that in our culture in the West, anger is an emotion that is poorly understood. It's often confused and conflated with aggression, which is not the same thing. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the emotional currency that seems prevalent right now is something like resentment. Resentment is something that is perhaps overindulged in these days, and enacted and all the rest, and that can create problems. I don't think that that's particularly healthy. For different generations, resentment was seen as an emotion that is, I don't know, it's something to be looked down upon. It's something that it's not good for the soul. It's the opposite of a stoic kind of mentality, that life is suffering, and learn to carry the suffering and take responsibility as much as possible for the hardships that you have to carry and endure. And so so there's the cultural kind of socially situatedness of a given emotion. Okay, so that's the 5 different components, the 5 different parts. Now next we might want to differentiate anger as a feeling from other emotions that are similar, but they're not quite the same thing, just so we don't get these things mixed up. So what it is that that you're experiencing, or what you're aiming at, and how it's different from some of these other ones. So first off, anger versus frustration. So people often get these muddled up a little bit. Now let's define frustration. We'll point out how it's different from anger. So frustration, I would say, we won't go through all the 5 different components of frustration, but on a cognitive level, it's an understanding of what you would like to be the case, what you had hoped would be the outcome, or what would occur in a given situation, and then reality as you experience it is very different. So there's a gap. This is happening on an interpretive or conceptual or cognitive level. There's a gap between what you had expected, what you had hoped for, what you had anticipated, and then what you are experiencing. There's a gap there. And then the feeling in your body is one of like agitation. Like you feel riled up, you feel just kind of all, kind of shaken up. It's almost like, metaphorically speaking, if you were to imagine like what it might feel like to be like a carbonated drink and someone just like shook you up and you're just in this agitated feeling. But it doesn't have like a directionality to it. It doesn't have a target like anger would have. So for example, you might be frustrated at not being able to solve a Rubik's Cube, but you're not angry at the Rubik's Cube. You might be frustrated at not being able to zip up your jacket on a cold day, but you're not angry with your jacket. So there's no agent, there's no person who is causing the frustration. So the anger is kind of a non-issue. It doesn't really show up in that way. And as well, you don't tend to get the heat in your body in the state of frustration. It's more of a tension-filled, riled up kind of, state. Now, that doesn't mean that anger can't lead, that frustration can't lead to anger. It often does, right? So you can say, well, I'm frustrated. And then we can say, well, who caused your frustration? Well, so-and-so did. And and what is the feeling toward that person for frustrating you? Well, I'm angry. Okay, so now you're angry, let's say. But there's that difference. It may feel a bit subtle, but it's an important difference that makes it can make a world of difference depending on what's going on there. So frustration and anger. Well, what about venting? What about when people are venting? What's going on there? I don't know if some of you would get this reference, but there was a show on TV. I don't know if it's still running or not, but This Hour Has 22 Minutes. It's a Canadian show. And there's this guy, Rick Mercer. He would do these Rick Mercer rants, and he would just be like this verbal barrage of just like, things that he takes issue with and sees problems with and so on. And it's just all this content, but he's in this state of tension as he's doing this. And it's kind of like a venting. And venting, in my opinion, is like a hyper cognitive or a hyper intellectualized or over intellectualized form of anger. So you're not really in the feeling of anger. It sort of gets transmuted into this hypercognitive thing, and you're just in this state of tension usually, or maybe even in frustration when you're in that mode of venting. So it's not quite the same thing. So venting can actually conceal or cover over genuine anger that doesn't have any room to breathe. And then venting, as some of you may know, when you're on the receiving end of someone who's venting, it often doesn't feel always productive, or there's no real depth of emotion to engage with, and so on. So frustration, venting. Okay, what about resentment? Well, resentment is similar to maybe the venting, but it's mostly in one's head kind of thing. It tends to be this hyper conceptual sense of ruminating about injustice and the unfairness of something, and how hard done by you are, but it's this like brooding, festering version of anger that just has no real energy to it, has no movement to it, and there's this bitterness, and it's just, the person is like stuck in it. They're slogging through that resentment. Maybe there's fantasies about getting even, or this kind of thing. Again, I don't see resentment as healthy at all, even though we're, once again, like, I think overindulging this stuff and encouraging it in many ways, being resentful toward certain groups of people, certain classes of people. This is very much like a Marxist type, framework. But anyway, that's another video entirely. And resentment can cover over, again, like anger. See, one of the other differences is that resentment can often be diffuse. It can be, resentment toward, some, non-human entity or whatever. There's no specificity to it. There's no like, well, which person actually hurt you? Well, all of them did. Resentment toward the world or something like this. Now you can have that resentment toward a person, of course, but again, it can cover over the genuine feelings of anger that the person does not have access to. So, in doing therapy work, we want to get beneath the resentment and try to acknowledge and give room to breathe so the person can feel, the relevant emotion of anger. What about passive-aggressiveness? Well, passive-aggressiveness is kind of like, it's an indirect way of, venting one's anger without doing it in earnest. So, a person may use sarcasm, or they may sigh or roll their eyes, or make a critical remark or dig or something like that. And if someone in the periphery there notices this sort of thing, they can infer perhaps that this individual is angry. But the person is not in that mode of anger necessarily. They might be kind of tense or uncomfortable or whatever, and it kind of vents in this way. And it's often the case that the person, because they're uncomfortable dealing with their anger directly, it takes this roundabout route with this passive aggressiveness. So that's different from the feeling of anger itself, again, which is primarily defined by the what it's like of that experience, the expansiveness, the warmth in your chest, the feeling of power in your body, the focus, and so on. So that's differentiating anger from some of those other emotions that kind of muddy the waters potentially. When I was in graduate school, we didn't do a whole lot of talk about anger. In fact, it was often taught to me that anger is almost always what we call a secondary emotion, that anger always conceals or covers over more vulnerable feelings that the person just has a hard time disclosing or revealing, and that anger is almost never useful or healthy, and so on. I used to believe some of that, and I've come to a totally different position on it now. I think anger is perfectly healthy and perfectly normal, and people can run into all kinds of problems by not having a healthy relationship with their anger. But it is true that anger, can conceal, or can work as a defense mechanism. So emotions can work as a defense mechanism to protect the person from experiencing more threatening emotions. Now, why would a vulnerable feeling be more threatening? Well, you open yourself up to potential hurt. Feeling in that moment of vulnerability, feeling dismissed or abandoned or whatever it might be. When you're in that feeling of aggression, it's protective. You don't have to be vulnerable. You're on the offense, or the feeling wants to be on the offense, right? But the one thing that's useful to understand, that it's often two sides of the same coin, right? So there's a structure to anger where, we might say that I'm angry at you for hurting me, or I'm angry at you for betraying me, I'm angry at you for dismissing me, I'm angry at you for neglecting me, or whatever that is. The anger is one thing, that's all that assertive energy and whatnot, but the feeling neglected, the feeling hurt, the feeling dismissed, and those kinds of emotions, it entails a softer feeling. It's a more vulnerable way of being. It's closer to, like a heaviness in the chest, a lump in the throat, being tearful, and shoulders dejected, and so on. That's the more vulnerable side. That's the soft underbelly of the anger. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that the real stuff is under the anger, necessarily, although that's often the case. Sometimes it's the case that the person can feel the more vulnerable feelings, but they can't, assert themselves in a way where they can experience the other side of the coin, which is the anger. Now, you can't be in two places at once. You want to be able to experience, both sides of it. And the context will matter a lot there as well. So I would say, for example, when you're in that, the anger as a feeling is useful to assert boundaries with people. So if you're in a workplace setting, and someone does something that is completely underhanded or disrespectful or whatever, you might, from that place of anger, you might say, Jim, you're not to do that. Again, I'm not going to put up with that. I just need you to know. And you do that with confidence and that assertive energy, which is what I would call the anger, and you're setting a boundary. You're not allowing yourself to be vulnerable with this person. You're not saying to this person, look, it really hurt me, that you took my work and kind of presented it as your own, and I feel kind of used and taken advantage of, and so on. You might not do that because this person hasn't earned the right or the privilege to know that softer, more vulnerable side of you. Whereas in a relationship, with like a best friend, or certainly in a romantic relationship, you almost always want to go to that softer, more vulnerable place, because you don't want to set boundaries in that relationship. That's kind of like, what I would say is like a last resort. Like if you've tried everything else, and that's, the last thing that you have available to you, certainly. But otherwise, you want the other person to know and understand like the impact on you in those more vulnerable ways. And then you don't have to set any boundaries or assert yourself, because through the other person's compassion and care and empathy, they want to address that all on their own, because you have that emotional connection with this person. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, one important thing, to really distinguish here and drive the point home and make sure that we keep this in the foreground, is the difference between anger and aggression. Okay, so this is something that, in my experience, like when you explain this to someone, it's often like, oh yeah, I get it. But then it's so easy to forget, because it's not something that we're really taught to distinguish. It's not something that we learn necessarily. And depending on our own experiences, these things can often get really entangled and muddied up, and it's hard to keep them separate, to understand and feel that there is definitely a difference. So, so anger is the feeling. So when I'm saying anger, or when I'm saying the assertive energy, I'm talking about the feeling. The aggression is the acting out in, let's say, an impulsive and dysregulated way. So it's the yelling, screaming, stomping around, throwing laptops and phones and punching, hands through drywall and doors, and, maybe even it's physically lashing out, the kicking and pushing and all that kind of thing. Now, physical aggression, I don't feel like I should need to say this, but just for the, make sure that we're on the same page. Physical aggression is almost always to be avoided. Like, that's not at all what we're aiming at here. That's nothing even close to what we're talking about, accessing and so on. There are places where it's warranted, but it's like, maybe protecting a child, from someone who is abusing that child in that moment where that's the only option, or defending yourself in a life or death situation. Or maybe there's like, socially sanctioned forms of aggression, like you're in martial arts and there's this, consensual sparring and whatnot. But that's different. That's not what we're talking about here. So there's the anger as a feeling, and then aggression, which we might describe as dysregulated anger or impulsive anger. Anger that just, is in too much of a hurry and it comes out in that way. So that's an important thing that we want to distinguish, the difference there. So it's interesting when we talk about people who have quote-unquote anger management problems. The problem may not be that they have an issue of managing their anger so much as they're unable to effectively regulate their anger. That could very well be the problem in many cases. So it's almost like, I think this is a metaphor that John Fredrickson uses. He's one of these ISTDP guys, intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy. I think he talked about like imagining, metaphorically speaking, that you have within you like a barrel, that you can just fill up with emotion. And in the case of anger, it's like, the feeling of anger, it comes in, it just fills this barrel up. And don't worry, because you might be worried that it's going to spill over and it's going to make a mess of things. No, this metaphorical barrel or cylinder within you, it can expand. It can be as big as it needs to be. It can hold all that anger, and that anger can just hang out there for as long as it needs to. Right? If you have a high capacity for regulating your anger, or regulating emotion in general, but anger in this context, you can experience the emotion without being overwhelmed by it, without it being impulsive or dysregulated, without without having to shut it down or clamp down on it, compartmentalize it, whatever that is. So, don't think of it like managing anger. Like anger is something I have to have a stranglehold on. I gotta keep it over there. I gotta push it over there. I gotta put it in a box or something. I don't think that that's the right approach. I think the right approach is to, maybe in the short term, maybe you got to do a little bit of that if there's problems in that way. But it's more about like allowing that feeling to be what it is, to hang out in that energy, that emotion. And we'll talk about a lot of this stuff in some of the follow-up videos. So the other thing to keep in mind is that when you notice a feeling, and in this case, anger, remember that anger is only a part of you, and you are made up of an infinite array of parts. And, so what does that involve? Well, there are parts of you that involve, your thoughts. There may be competing thoughts vying for your attention. Some of them, you've decisively kind of mapped out on your own. Some are thoughts that are kind of modes of speaking because of the culture that you happen to find yourself in. Some are half-baked, some are fully formed. There are sensations, feelings, moods, competing emotions. There are your moral sensibilities and passions, pursuits, ethics, your futural strivings, your recollection of the past, you're anticipating the future. Like all these different things, comprise you. And you want to keep in mind that your anger is just like a small part of you. So when we pay attention to the anger, we notice the anger, and we listen to the anger, and we allow the anger to come into the foreground, all we're doing is we're just letting it take center stage for a moment so we can understand it. And that's often what you need to do in order to regulate that emotion, to hang out in the feeling for a time. Doesn't mean it needs to control you. It doesn't mean that, that you let it, sit in the driver's seat and drag you around, wherever it wants to go. And it doesn't mean that you have to agree with whatever impulse, it seems to be moving toward. So, for example, with anger, it is often the case that, let's say you feel hurt by someone, you feel dismissed, you feel disrespected, perhaps you were abused by someone, it makes sense that, you have a feeling toward that individual, and maybe the feeling is anger, and that you get that expansive energy and the power in your body and so on. Now, what will often happen is that, if you ask yourself, like, well, what does this feeling want? It will often be the case that feeling wants to be violent. That feeling wants to lash out. That feeling wants to grab hold of that person, or otherwise, maybe in more subdued versions, it wants to just at least give this person a good verbal blasting, just, rage at them, or just, say just some vicious, cutting, thing that you can come up with. Now, does that make you a bad person, that you fantasize in maybe even some violent way, what the anger wants to do? Well, no, because that's not you. That's your anger. That's the anger that takes center stage for a moment, and you're listening to what it would want if it was in full control, but it's not. At least if you're able to regulate that feeling. And the feeling wants to be violent. That's often what anger is. Now again, let's not get this muddied up with aggression. The aggression is the acting it out in reality. And you hopefully, you don't want to act it out. You don't want to be a violent person. You don't want to do any of that kind of stuff. But the feeling does, and it's important to recognize that so that you can give yourself permission to explore that fantasy or that mental enactment of what the feeling is aiming at, or what the feeling wants in a sense. The reason why it's so important to do that is that when you have a mental kind of fantasy or a mental enactment of what the emotion wants or desires or is how it wants to be expressed. When you do that, when you give yourself permission to daydream about it for a moment, that little span of time is useful for your body. It gives your body permission to breathe through that energy, right? And your body almost doesn't know the difference between the acting it out in reality and just the fantasizing about it and being able to kind of hang out in that energy for a time. It might only be like 20 seconds. But that's part of how you learn to regulate those emotions, or so that's part of that. So now, if you have concerns like, well, wow, there's a psychologist online who's saying like, yeah, it's good to fantasize in some violent way from time to time to work through that anger, or to let that anger move through you and just kind of wash through you and do its thing. Again, I'm not encouraging violence. I'm not advocating for aggression, and that's not, that mental enactment or daydream. That's not you. That's the feeling, and you want to keep those things separate. Now you can test it out. Like if you were to say then, like, well, what if I actually did that? What if I actually did that? What if I actually acted out in that violent way, and I can see this person now hurt physically and so on? Most people, if you follow that through in your mind, and you really kind of commit yourself to it, you really try to make it as real as possible in your mind, most people at that point, they would feel tremendous guilt, or maybe feeling ashamed. I don't want to be that kind of person. And that's a good test. It's a good reminder that that's more of who you are. You're not the violent, aggressive person, although you have that capacity within you, which is important to recognize. But if you were to act it out, you would feel bad, because that's not who you are. And if you don't have that guilt reaction, then I would say that you may be kind of repressing some of that guilt response, or perhaps there's the chance that you're a psychopath or something. I mean, most people have that feeling reaction, and I mean the reality is that people who have anger management issues, most people that I've worked with, they blow up and they yell and mistreat the people that they love, they care about, and they feel tremendous shame afterward. It's this vicious cycle, So that's important to keep in mind there. Now, the other thing I want to say about anger is the relationship between anger and shame. So it is often the case that they do have a relationship. When anger is able to show up in a healthy way, you can feel the expansive energy, the assertive feeling, the warmth in your body, the confidence, the readiness to kind of handle yourself, and hopefully that's just acted out in pro-social ways, just being assertive and that kind of thing. But when you have access to that, it's helpful it safeguards you against feelings of shame. Like, feelings of shame are kind of like, well, I'm the problem here. It's all my fault. I'm just foolish. I'm just silly. I'm just stupid, and maybe I deserve this. And that's what shame sounds like. It's a self-attack. When you can direct that energy outward, I'm not the cause of my own pain. This person is, in this instance, let's say, right? Then the anger is able to show up, and anger intuits that you are a person worthy of care and dignity and respect, and that you are worth protecting ultimately. So if shame is a non-issue, then anger can show up in a healthy way. Conversely, if shame is there, and you have like a shame complex where you're just constantly attacking yourself, it's like anger turned inward, it becomes shame, then anger can't get off the ground. And I don't know which one comes first, quite honestly. I don't know if you need to have that connection to a visceral feeling of anger in order for self-worth and to be there, and shame to be a non-issue, or I don't know if self-worth has to be there for anger to show up. Maybe they're a twin birth. I believe that's kind of the case. Chicken or the egg. But that's an interesting thing to keep in mind, that relationship between anger and shame. And so oftentimes when I work with people, I'm kind of testing some of this out, and it's often the case with people who have problems with anger, they often go to that shame place. So I'm going to get into more detail, I think, about with some of that stuff in the videos to come. But anyway, so that's an overview of like the metaphysics of anger, the being, the what it's like of anger, what makes anger what it is, the 5 different components that comprise anger, the primary, piece being like the phenomenology of it, the symptoms, the sensations of anger. We talked about, how the anger is different from other emotions like frustration, venting, resentment, and passive-aggressiveness. We talked about this idea of anger being a secondary emotion, but that's not the full story, of course. There's 2 sides to the same coin. We talked about the capacity to regulate anger, which is what you want to aim at. Feel your anger without it being impulsive, without it being dysregulated. So we talked about anger and aggression, and how anger is a part of you, but it's not the whole of you, and how some of that might work. So hopefully there's something insightful there in all of that, and I really look forward to following up with the next videos. We'll do a video on problems with quote unquote too much anger, that looks like the person who's always raging and getting upset, and it's impulsive and dysregulated and so on. And then I'll do another video with people who, in my opinion, have little access to anger, and so they tend to be passive and sheepish and fearful of conflict. They get walked all over, taken advantage of, and so on, just because of their compliant nature. So we'll talk about those issues in those 2 follow-up videos. Okay, thanks for sticking around here and watching the video. Feel free to offer some comments below, reactions, thoughts, other considerations that maybe I've neglected. Share the video with others that might be able to benefit, and like and subscribe if you haven't already done that. Okay, thanks.